Hello and welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest, Hanson. If you're new to the podcast, thanks for joining us today. And if you've listened before, welcome back. Today, we're going to be focusing on what is probably the most influential and the most controversial approach in all of psychology, psychoanalysis. If you're listening to this podcast, you've probably seen those cartoons of somebody lying on a couch with a silent therapist just out of view. But behind those cliches is a set of ideas that fundamentally changed Western medicine's understanding of mental illness. The radical take of psychoanalysis was that symptoms could be caused by psychological forces rather than purely physical ones, and that we might not even be aware of those forces as they operated inside of us. It popularized or introduced concepts like the unconscious mind, repression, psychological defenses, and transference, all of which come up on this podcast regularly. At the same time, psychoanalysis didn't exist in a vacuum. It came out of a particular moment in European history. It was shaped by the philosophical currents of that era, and it was deeply intertwined, often in very complicated and uncomfortable ways, with the broader social beliefs that dominated that period. So this is the first of two episodes we're going to be doing on psychoanalysis. In the first half of today's episode, we're going to be talking about what psychoanalysis actually is, including its key ideas and the clinical techniques those ideas led to. Then in the second half, I want to have more of a meta conversation about all of this. What was going on in the world that led to these ideas, and how should that inform what we take from psychoanalysis today, and what's maybe best left in the past? Then, the next time that we talk about psychoanalysis, our second episode, we're going to be talking more about the branching tree of it, including exploring a number of key thinkers, their ideas, and their influence on the modern practice of therapy. So this is going to be a big one. I've been doing a ton of prep for this episode. I'm very excited for it, and I'm going to need a lot of help. So I'm joined today by clinical psychologist, Dr. Rick Hanson. Dad, how are you doing today?
What did you mean by that?
Are you feeling defensive, Dad? Are you a little defended right now?
I'm starting with kind of the stereotype of the analyst, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And
yeah.
You may have seen this cartoon in which these two obvious Freudian analysts are walking past each other. And in the first panel, you see them approaching. In the second panel, each of them says, hello, hello. And then in the third panel, you see the thought balloons above their head. What did he mean by that? Right. So I thought I would just start that way. I'm good, and I'm looking forward to this.
Very much the same. I have been doing so much work for this episode. I hope that it comes through. My outline for this sucker is like 20 pages long, and I want to start with a little bit of context here. On the show in general, and particularly when we talk about therapy, we are operating inside of the Western medical model. Psychoanalysis exists inside of that medical model, and it is broadly considered therapy's starting point within it. But the psychoanalysts were not the first people in the world to come up with the idea that our thoughts matter and the content of our thoughts has an impact on us physically. But they were the first people who were able to get this idea into that Western medical model. So that's one of the reasons that psychoanalysis has been so influential. The second framing point that I really want to focus on here is that whenever we do this episode or a future episode on a family of therapy, I don't think it's really possible to understand the theories here, including the practice of therapy, like what's going on in the room between the clinician and the client, without understanding the moment in time that these approaches come from. What was going on in the world? What were the ideas that were bubbling around? Humanistic psychology, for example, which I want to do a future episode on. It was all about the civil rights movement. It came up in that moment in time. Rogers was deeply influenced by that kind of all the thinking that was going on, the stuff that was happening in the world. And it was a kind of response to some of the ideas that psychoanalysis and behaviorism had that were, took, as we'll talk about today, a bit of a more negative view of human nature. And so even as we get more current in time, if we look at somatic approaches to therapy or IFS or whatever out, they're coming out of a particular moment in thought. And you can sort of start to see how clinical practice is not this isolated little bubble, but instead is being heavily influenced by so much other stuff that's going on out in the world. So as somebody who's thought about this for a long time, Dad, and kind of seen this flow back and forth, what do you think about that?
First off, I think the big swing you just took there is deeply interesting, and it is curious that therapists who tend to have a deep tradition of exploring the personal history of their client are very often not very curious about the history of their own profession and its contextualization, its embeddedness. So I think that's a beautiful thing you're doing. I did twitch slightly if someone was looking at my face when you were speaking, just about the general statement that, yes, historically, psychoanalysis emerged in a very medical context. And Freud really wanted to ground it in the context of himself being a neurologist. So they wanted to legitimize psychoanalysis in this Victorian context in that medical frame. All that said, fairly rapidly, people like Jung and
as we will talk about,
Carl
absolutely.
Rogers and others, and this has been a long thread in certainly clinical psychology, really have resisted the medicalization. Yeah. And then you have people like Steve Hayes who have strongly and very analytically and skillfully resisted the generalization structure of a medical diagnostic category. It is clear that people who have strep throat are really quite like other people with strep throat, but people who are depressed can be very, very different from each other. And their own experience of depression can vary widely internally over a period of time. So that's interestingly why the symbol for the American Psychological Association is the trident from Poseidon. And one end of the bar is very square-edged. It's a parallelogram. That's the science aspect. But the other side is curving. That's the art aspect. And the combination of those two, I think, is the space we tend to transit in this podcast.
I think you're right on. And I love that you're bringing this in already. It's psychoanalysis's tortured relationship with the medical model in general will be something that we talk about a little bit. And like how scientific is this kind of at all, and how do we feel about that will also be for sure a piece of the conversation. But before we get too in the weeds, Dad, I want to start here with a deceptively simple question. What is psychoanalysis?
So some disclaimers briefly. In my own personal journey, I went to graduate school in developmental psychology, and then I ended up at the Wright Institute in Berkeley, which is one of these leading freestanding accredited institutes that turns out PhDs at the time, now PsyDs, in clinical psychology. And the Wright Institute, when I entered it, was heavily psychodynamic, very psychoanalytic. So I would say in graduate school, I got a thorough infusion.
Yeah.
The Kool-Aid was routinely served every day in our classes and in the student lounges. And meanwhile, I did a fairly brief Jungian therapy that was heavily focused on dreams. And then in my own personal practice, I would never say that I'm psychoanalytically trained or that I practice psychoanalysis. So with that disclaimer, I would say I have quite a lot of book learning about psychoanalysis, and some of my friends, are very deep in that world.
I really appreciate the disclaimer, Dad. I also trust your ability to give a relatively straightforward summary of this for a podcast listening audience.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I'm done. Well, the essence of psychoanalysis goes back all the way to the so-called talking cure. The fundamental simplicity of an individual in a room, sitting or lying on a couch, sharing most freely and most intimately of their inner world with someone who is listening profoundly, who, in terms of the original aim, which Freud himself deviated from sometimes, of bringing a tremendous amount of benevolent neutrality to whatever the client brought up. And then just imagine the essence of this. It's a very vulnerable nakedness of the psyche. You are unpacking your psyche, which is being analyzed, psychoanalysis, by you and the analyst. What's that like? That's the essence of the process. It's very unstructured, it's free-floating, there's a process of free association. There's a general encouragement to keep unpacking. In a way, the central question of psychoanalysis is, so what is it that you have always been wanting? Because as you'll be talking about, it's very interested in the underlying drives, including unconscious drives that have been moderated and regulated, suppressed, displaced, disowned. It's very interested in that. It's also extremely interested because it's such a bare frame. It works with what's in the room. So it's extremely interested in the relationship of the client to the therapist and what the client is bringing up or not bringing up, or bringing up in disguised
What they feel
forms.
about the therapist, the nature of the relationship between the two of them, all of that. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that is really beyond all the cliches. It's a process, honestly, when it's done well, of vulnerable speaking in a context of deep, respectful, receptive listening.
I think that's really well said. It's a really good summary. And then the question is, well, what are you exploring in the room with each other, right? And that takes us to maybe a little bit of an academic description here, which I'll give. Psychoanalysis is broadly considered the starting point for modern approaches to therapy. It's kind of the great-great-grandfather of what people do today. And it's a set of both theories and techniques. And the techniques kind of flow from the theories, so it's helpful to understand both of them. That's based on investigating the unconscious mind. So what is an unconscious? What's in it? How does stuff get there? All of those kinds of questions. And then taking that unconscious material that we've talked about on the podcast a lot and bringing it up into our conscious awareness. So the person is like, oh, that really is a thing for me. And then finding different kinds of ways to process it more effectively, including by bringing it in some sense to who we are. We talk about self-concept a lot on the podcast, and a lot of those kinds of like self-concept or the notion of the ego in therapy, that also sort of flows from the psychoanalytic tree. Now, prior to psychoanalysis, and I think it's really helpful to understand this stuff. Again, I found the history of this so interesting when I was learning about it. The dominant view in Western medicine was that mental illness, any kind of symptomology that somebody has that seems to be psychological in origin, was based on one of the following things, by and large. First, some kind of a neurological ailment. The person had like a lesion on the brain that was causing them to behave in this way. Second, it was some kind of a moral failure. This is from the more sort of philosophical traditions. It also has a lot of very complex and problematic ties to colonial thought that we'll get into. Or third, this was not so much a medical view, but certainly a lot of people thought that you were just possessed by an evil spirit, or that like an evil demon was possessing you, or God was punishing you, or something spiritual was going on. So there are these kind of 5 key insights of psychoanalysis that I actually did not realize that these sort of came from psychoanalysis when I was first learning about it. And then first one, big one, psychological stuff can underlie mental illness. Second one, these causes are often unconscious. Not only is it the case that your kind of psychological material could be messing you up, you could be totally unaware of it. And it could be based on things that you're totally unaware of. Then third, these processes are dynamic in nature. This is where the word psychodynamics comes from. The mind is not just a passive container of thoughts, it is an active system of forces. And these different parts of the mind, I use the word parts there. You think about IFS, you think about other traditions in therapy, again, very influenced by this idea. These different parts can have different motivations, and they could come into conflict with each other. And the symptoms the person has flow in some way kind of naturally from the conflict and compromises between these different forces. Our fourth one, mental and physical symptoms are interconnected. Hey, if you practice somatic psychotherapy, you are at least somewhat influenced by psychoanalysis, a fact that many somatic therapists have some difficulties with. And then fifth, processing this psychic material can lead to some kind of relief from symptoms. And this is the truly radical idea. It's not just that your mental material causes problems for you. It's not just that it's unconscious in nature. It's not just that it's dynamic and that's based on compromises between forces. It's that you can actually do something about it. You can let the fizz out of the bottle. And then we got to figure out how. And enter all of the early psychoanalysts and their quest to go, wait a second, what's going on in there? And how can we help people get that stuff out and express it more effectively?
To introduce kind of a framing for some of what we'll talk about, there is a difference between the theory or the explanations for why we are doing something and what we are doing.
Yes.
So, in other words, and sometimes the what we are doing, such as encouraging someone to come into a very safe container that's completely private, doors closed, and gradually open up in relationship with another person. That could be a method. Now, the theory of why that method works could be true or not, but they're decoupled from each other. And that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind. Just because the method works, that itself is not inherently a proof of the theory.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing to think about is to disconnect or decouple the founder or teacher in a tradition such as psychoanalysis or a religious tradition even, to decouple the vagaries of that individual from the worth or not of the methods and the theories that they've propounded.
A little bit of art and the artist going on here. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So, for example, it's a fact, to talk about Jung for a moment, that he had sexual relations with several, at least, of his patients over the years that today would lead to losing your license, if not jail time. So, keep that into account. On the other hand, we can look at what he created on its own merits or not. Anyway, the third distinction is between what people say they do and what they actually do. So I remember this study I encountered a long time ago that asked people to describe their approach, their method, and then independent people were coding and rating sessions like videotapes.
What they saw the person doing as they
actually
practiced.
doing.
Yeah,
and
totally.
then the differences really get reduced. And there are many more similarities than differences. The theories could be wildly different between an ardent CBT therapist here and an ardent psychoanalyst there. And yet what they actually do in the room could be a lot more similar.
Great points here, Dad. I love that you're bringing this in. And I want to talk about some of those ideas in a second. Like, what are the actual ideas that we're having about this? But I also want to give a quick disclaimer flag here. I want to be really clear. The psychoanalysts did not come up with the nature or come up with the idea that we have an unconscious mind. That is just absolutely not true. Some of the earliest records that we have of something approximating the unconscious actually come from Hinduism and the notion of samskaras, which are these kinds of mental impressions. Every thought or action leaves an imprint on the mind, and those imprints affect us in some kind of mysterious way. Even Buddhism has the notion of storehouse consciousness, which is kind of sort of the unconscious.
Name check in that one for us.
Yeah, you like
Good
that one, Dad?
Yeah.
Thought you like that one. In the West, in the 50s, there was this philosopher Schopenhauer. He had already talked about unconscious conflict.
The 1850s.
1850s, sorry, wrong. Yeah, 1850s, not 1950s.
He was before Elvis.
Yeah, totally. The philosophy of the unconscious was this book that was actually pretty popular in 1869, I think it was, or whenever it was published. Point being, the psychoanalysts had a take on the unconscious. They did not invent the notion of the unconscious. We're discovering. I just want to kind of make sure our I's are dotted and our T's are crossed there. Okay, some of these key ideas. So what are we actually talking about here? First key idea, structure of the mind. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Dad?
Well, okay, great. So in classic psychoanalysis, think of the mind as like a parfait with these three layers. You have conscious mind, that's what you're consciously aware of in the moment. Then we could have pre-conscious, which is material that is not really in the foreground of the mind. It might even be muttering away in the deep background, kind of in the wallpaper, or currently out of awareness, but fairly easily accessible. And then we have the murky depths, the unconscious mind, which is not directly accessible, and yet its activities and dynamics and forces can be revealed in part through semi-conscious processes like dreams, or processes of free association, or slips of the tongue, or enactments in everyday life, such as in the Transference with the psychotherapist. So that's kind of the layering. And then in that layering, we have the so-called ego, superego, and id. Starting with the id is in the unconscious mind. It's sort of synonymous with it. It's this bubbling cauldron. It's characterized, and you'll get into the colonialist Victorian context, as really pretty nasty and needs to be regulated. So then we have the superego, which is the internalization of society's norms, think Victorian era, some of which are very strict and often gendered in terms of shoulds, right? And then which partake of a person's kind of normal conscience, their healthy conscience. And the two together form roughly the superego. And then you have the poor ego in between the two, kind of trying to regulate and negotiate between the intense, bubbling demands coming up from the id, thou shalt, thou shalt, thou shalt, right? And then we have the superego saying, no, 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 you shall not. No, 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 you shall not. And then we have the poor ego somewhere trapped in the middle.
And people could think about this a little bit through the lens of their own life. Like we all have these things inside of us that we regulate really heavily. And sometimes it's appropriate to regulate those things. And sometimes we're actually kind of overregulated. And both of these issues can cause different kinds of problems for us. And if somebody were working with an analyst, part of the work that they would be doing together is exploring, okay, why are we regulating? What are we regulating? And do we really need to regulate it that much? Can we find a healthier way to work with this material that's kind of bubbling up for us?
Yeah, there's a lot of, it's interesting. The Buddha was a farmer. He was a gentleman farmer, kind of an upper class person 2,500 years ago. And there's a lot of languaging that comes from agriculture. They talk about what are the nutriments, the poisons, what are you putting in the ground? What are you growing? In psychoanalysis, there are a lot of plumbing metaphors. Hydraulic metaphors, including related to the id as this sort of cauldron under pressure that needs to find its forms of release. And then the question really is this person finding forms of release that are problematic? Are they acting out in problematic ways? Or do they find forms of release in which they can continue to function in polite society? Remembering as well that Freud himself was an upper class, Jewish physician in Vienna of the time, and his clients were almost all from similar class levels who could afford individual treatments. In that context, then you look for appropriate forms of release that would enable you to reach the pinnacle of psychoanalysis and become a normal neurotic.
And I love the idea, by the way, of the normal neurotic. I think that in some ways, it's a much healthier target for people. We actually had an episode, I think it was like a year ago or something, where we talked about this a bit. Then a lot of the, I don't know, we just did our episode on the problems with the self-help world. And I think that there's so much in the self-help world that's about this kind of peak experience having that I don't know if it's aspirational or if it's realistic for most people living ordinary lives. And I think the notion of a normal neurotic is much more kind of aspirational and accessible for people. So part of what you're speaking to here, Dad, as you give this description, is this interplay between repression and experiencing out or catharsis. So we have these feelings that are unacceptable to the moral conscience that we have, our superego, and to some extent to our ego. But our id still has these desires, right? Our id still wants these different things. That energy has to go somewhere. Freud's whole notion was that energy is indestructible, so that if we have an experience, we have a memory, whatever it is, we need to either release it in some way, or it gets kind of stuck in us. And this is repression. Which, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably already familiar with what repression is or being repressed is. And I think that Freud definitely got, there's a lot of weird stuff in there, a lot of stuff that I don't think has aged particularly well. I think he kind of nailed repression, in my personal opinion. This is just me. The notion that we have these wants and desires and needs, and if we don't deal with them in some kind of an effective way, they start to create problems for us in our life. I think that you can just observe that in most people. And then so the question is, what do we do with this? This energy has to go somewhere. This is the notion of experiencing out, which I believe was referred to as apreaction initially by Freud. And this idea is that once the material is repressed, it's going to cause us problems until we get rid of it. And a key part of the psychoanalytic process is bringing that unconscious content and therefore the associated repressed material into our awareness so we can get this energy out of us in healthy ways. And Freud initially thought that the way that we would do this was actually by literally reliving or literally acting out an experience in order to kind of purge it of the emotional hold that it had over us. We're going to talk about one particular case study in a second, the Anna O case study. It's very, very well known. And this was part of the work that was involved in that case study. These days, people don't really think about it that way. We don't want to re-traumatize people. We don't want to reactivate them by causing them to directly pull up some kind of a traumatic memory. There are other ways to go about this sort of process. But the general point here of this kind of release of energy, I think is a great one to take away. And it's one of the aspects of psychoanalysis that I think has aged kind of well.
The notion of making the unconscious conscious, of course, is really central. And the languaging that I acquired in Est of experiencing out, the idea that is very consistent with current work on trauma and understanding of the brain, that emotional memory can become stored unconsciously in neural networks that are entwined with the body. And there are many healthy ways of experiencing it out. That certainly that's an important thing, that can happen. And then with regard to the actual practice of psychoanalysis, I'm struck by two things. On the one hand, it is analysis of the psyche with the notion that the analysis alone, the insight, sometimes aided by the quote unquote interpretation, skillfully and in terms of time, at just the right time offered by the analyst, that can produce, in effect, liberating insight in the mind of the client. Well, that's extremely close to both cognitive therapy these days and the insight practices of vipassana in early Buddhism. The idea that the truth shall set you free. That's so on the one hand. So there tends to be a pretty cognitive element in a lot of psychodynamic work. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, since it's quite non-directive and the therapist, the analyst is working with what's very available in the room is the interpersonal field between the client and the therapist. And that is very vulnerable. That's very emotional. That can be very emotional because then you find people who are needing to kind of face and admit that as a 45-year-old successful person who can afford psychoanalysis, they are enacting patterns in which they feel like they're 3 years old with their therapist, which sometimes can become eroticized, which can become even more vulnerable and juicy to talk about. So both of them are true. There is this analytic cognitive element, but particularly to the extent that the relational processes are brought in, that can be really quite vulnerable and emotional and juicy.
Yeah, right on. And you're talking about transference and countertransference, two of the things that I think have also aged well from psychoanalysis. The idea of transference, this is when the client is sort of redirecting those feelings onto the therapist, but then also countertransference, the therapist's own emotional reactions to the client. And both of these can be used as kind of data. Then psychological defenses basically comes from psychoanalysis. We've talked about psychological defenses all the time on the podcast. And then the final thing I want to talk about for just 1 second here is something I think has maybe not aged so well, which was Freud's intense focus on sexuality and the development of sexuality. So he thought that personality develops through a series of stages in childhood. Each of these would be focused on a different erogenous zone, and how the child navigated these stages would shape both their personality and their neuroses. And neuroses are distinct from psychoses or psychosis, a mental or emotional disorder that might cause somebody suffering, but it isn't psychotic in nature. He laid out these different stages and the ages associated with them. They sort of ran up to puberty, and a final one that ran from puberty onward. I don't want to get into them in detail, in part because I think they've aged really poorly. And Freud's massive focus on sexuality and sexual development was actually one of the things that led to a lot of criticism of him at the time from his peers, including being pretty directly responsible for his ultimate falling out with Carl Jung, his longtime collaborator and kind of sort of student. They had a kind of mentorship relationship in different kinds of ways.
Identified successor.
Yeah, the guy he had pegged as like, this is going to be the future of this field. And they had a pretty intense and public falling out with each other, based in large part on Freud's kind of focus on sexual development as a major piece of the work.
I paused there because everything you're saying is true. There was this reductionistic quality in Freud in which, as an individual, he fell in love with his ideas. And then let's also locate him in his time. For one, he belonged to a very beleaguered population, Jewish people in Austria, and also coming up with his various theories of the talking cure with a fair amount of attention to sexuality. It was very controversial. So he, of
Extremely,
course,
yeah.
hunkered down and was beleaguered and really defended himself. All that said, one thing that was, I think, a useful takeaway was for Freud to fuel the growing need to understand that children are not little grown-ups.
Mm-hmm.
They have a developmental trajectory that is unique and sacred even of its own. Yeah. We could argue about the nature of that trajectory, but it's different than what it is to be a fully formed adult. For Freud to kind of normalize those aspects and to not make it some sort of aberrant, disgusting, dirty thing, there's some value in that too.
Sure, yeah.
And then in terms of the detail of the stages, the oral stage where you're focusing on being fed, just the naming of the stages helps people highlight events that may well have been really important, or repeated events that may have been important for them during those times in their life that they tend to not think about as related to their current problems. I can say for myself, I know that my mom once told me, we fed you according to a schedule because that was the advice of the time, but you cried so much that after a while we threw that book away and just fed you when you wanted. So I thought to myself, thanks, Mom, really, good for you.
Yeah,
and what the fuck was I dealing with as a young kid? And I could relate that. And when I knew that, when I learned that, as I don't know how old I was, my mid-30s, I could relate that to some underlying psychological material that felt bereft and lost, and no one was coming for me. So anyway, identifying these issues is a way for people to know themselves better.
Great. And totally point well taken. For me, the aspect of it that it hasn't aged particularly well is more Freud's specific descriptions of them, and the close ties that he draws between an issue at a moment in time and a particular kind of symptomology that a person might have, or a particular kind of mental illness that a person might have. In part because we don't want to be reductive, right? We don't want to be like, this happened to you, therefore you are screwed up in this way. And that was a major feature of Freud's work. He did a lot of, this thing happened to you, that must mean that. And we've tried to become essentially more scientific over time about being more observational and less judgmental about what's going on inside of the mind of a person. So to bring our part one of this episode kind of to a close a little bit here, Dad, if somebody was listening to us talking about this and going, you know what, this seems kind of cool. I sort of would like to work with a psychoanalyst or something like that. What's the actual shape of psychoanalytic therapy? What does it look like these days? Do people actually still practice it? And maybe what are some of the key techniques or key ideas that people are actually using in the room?
Yeah. So with the disclaimer that I have not walked into the room myself on either side of the role.
In some time. Yeah. Because you worked with a Jungian analyst, right?
Yeah. People who are certified, as it were, to do psychoanalysis typically have gone through a long analysis of their own, and they have participated in some very substantial trainings. Early on, psychoanalysis was pretty much reserved for psychiatrists who were gatekeepers in America. I don't know exactly what happened in Europe through the 1950s. And there was a lot of resistance to broadening the guild and allowing non-physicians into the psychoanalytic world. So there's something about that. But the point being, you're with someone who, whatever their issues may be, has deeply explored their own psyche and been in a culture and a training process in which there's tremendous attention to subtleties and granularities of experiential processes, including as how they are revealed by the words, the tone, the physical posture, and behavior, like always arriving 1 minute late for sessions, or how money is handled. Just so that you're with someone who's very, very present. So there you are. And you are essentially invited with very little structure to talk. And then, because it's such a blank screen, whatever you put up on that screen is really yours. This is a very non-interfering frame if it's done, traditionally. And then you think, what is it like to be with someone who's completely present with you for this period? Their mind might wander a little bit, but they bring it right back. And the silence starts taking on a weight of its own. And you start to become aware of what you're saying. You find yourself telling the same story. Why do I keep talking about this? Why do I not tell them that I feel lonely in my marriage? Why do I keep, reporting on my day rather than saying how I really feel? So there's, right, a gradual interest in that. And then it unfolds from there. But I would just like to really emphasize and normalize the power of that interested silence.
So obviously, I haven't either trained as a psychoanalyst, and I also haven't done a course of psychoanalytical psychotherapy. But when I was reading about it, one of the aspects of the technique that I found the most interesting was using silence, essentially. It's quite normal, apparently, for the analyst to just be hanging out for a pretty extended period of time while the client is sort of going through this process of talking or feeling about themselves. And I can say even in the most minor possible version of this, like the doing a coaching session or something that I've done, there's a way where 15 seconds of silence feels like a long time.
Yeah.
If you're just willing to let it kind of go. And often something really interesting comes up at the end of 15 or 20 or 30 seconds of silence, let alone, 5 minutes of silence or whatever's going on in those rooms.
Yeah. And as a result, on the one hand, a real psychoanalysis, if you can afford it, which typically, as you know, is multiple sessions per week for
a long period
several
of time.
years, it can really feel like, wow, a deep unpacking and airing out of the various rooms in the mansion of the mind. And involved in this, as a result, can be a very deep self-acceptance as you become more and more known to yourself, and the natural forces and dynamics, going back to that kind of more hydraulic model, they start to balance with each other and normalize. There can be a releasing of repressions of feelings of shame, for example, all that can be really available to someone. On the other hand, people can really spin wheels in psychoanalysis for years at a time. And I had a friend who just said in passing, he was a young psychiatrist, that at that point he had invested, several years, 4 or 5 years of 3 to 4 sessions a week with his analyst. Wow. He had spent, at that point in middle 85, let's say, $150,000 already. And I knew him as, wow, you're really
if you've got that money to spend, buddy.
Neurotic. You're getting flipped out over little things, and you're kind of intense, and you don't seem to have much self-awareness about what a jerk you're being in this group that we're in. So I kind of wonder about that. So both things can be true. The profundity of that invitation and the openness in it. On the other hand, the possibility of wasting a lot of time.
Totally. And just to add a little bit to what you're saying here, Dad, that sort of more traditional form of psychoanalysis with the couch and, 2 years of sessions multiple times a week, that is actually very rarely practiced these days. It's a very uncommon approach to therapy, in part because it's just not that practical for all of the reasons that you're naming here. It also has limited empirical support. That isn't to say that it doesn't work. It's just essentially impossible to study something like that. I don't even know how you would begin to build the study design for a real formal modern study on long-term psychoanalysis. It just wouldn't be practical. Yeah. And what's emerged instead are things that are known as brief psychodynamic therapies. These are therapies that integrate psychoanalytic ideas into other approaches, and they are, hello, it's right there in the name, a little bit brief. Typically less than 25 sessions. Some people like to push to 40, but it's sort of in that range. There's more of an active role of the clinician because of this, because you gotta get in there a little bit more. You can't just sit there quietly for a session because you don't have a session to burn. And it typically focuses more on a specific issue or conflict, as opposed to just trying to unpack everything that's going on down there. But it still uses a lot of core psychodynamic assumptions. So the unconscious shapes our feelings and our behavior. these past experiences that we've had really matter. Our defenses protect us against painful feelings, but then have other consequences, of course. So all of that stuff is still in there. They've just kind of tried to find a way to repackage it in a way that's more accessible for people in the modern world.
This is fantastic, Forrest. And I got to say, having gone through grad school, people could save themselves a lot of time in grad school. Just listen to this episode.
We've honestly, the greatest flattery I've ever received about the podcast is that I do have friends who, since we started doing it, who have gone to psychology graduate school and all of that. We have had moments where friends of mine have been like, my professor assigned an episode of your podcast as part of the coursework. Like that was part of the homework, was to listen to an episode of our podcast, which I was like, wow, I'm so deeply flattered by this. I cannot even tell you. So big shout out to anybody who's doing that or who bumped into the podcast through their graduate school experience. Yeah.
So I'm really glad, by the way. I'm a friendly neighbor to psychoanalysis.
Yeah, you have a little bit of that inclination.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we've been able to establish that sort of friendly, appreciating and valuing of it. Because now I really invite you, Forrest, to give us a background on where does psychoanalysis come from?
Sure.
What's the history? What's the context? How does it relate to Victorianism, colonialism, in some, kind of, hey, give us the Willies context.
Yeah. No, okay, great. I'm glad that we did 35, 40 minutes of polite, loving understanding of psychoanalysis before we get into the weeds here. So, okay, let's do a little bit on the early history here. I think it's really, again, as I said at the very beginning of the podcast, it's really helpful to understand where this stuff comes from and what's going on in the world and like, why are they thinking these thoughts about the mind? I also just found this really personally fascinating when I was learning about it. So I'm just going to kind of riff here for a minute, and it may or may not be relevant to people, but I thought it was super cool. So I hope that you do as well. So a lot of key figures here. A couple names maybe to know, obviously Freud. He was born in 1856, died in 1939. That's a pretty good bookend for this sort of early phase that we'll be talking about. So what actually happened here? How did we get to some of the things we've been talking about so far? Freud originally trained as a neurologist in Vienna. So late 19th century, European psychiatry was dominated by body-based explanations for mental illnesses. They thought that mental illness was based on some kind of neurological problem, an anatomical lesion or a physical brain problem. These were the most common explanations. So in 1885, Freud goes as a neurologist and studies under this French doctor, Jean-Martin Charcot. And he's a doctor in Paris, and he's formed this clinic, this incredible neurology clinic that was like world leading at the time, bringing together all of these doctors trying to figure out what was this hysteria thing that has been just sweeping the country, right? And Charcot thought that hysteria was a brain problem. He thought it was based on physical issues inside of the brain, but that it didn't have any identifiable lesions, any physical things that you could see if you pop somebody's skull open or something like that. And this was really bugging him. So he was experimenting with hypnosis, which they were very into at the time, as a way to treat hysteria. And he found that you could both induce hysterical symptoms and address them through hypnosis. Now, this didn't make any sense because that meant that hysteria could be entirely physical, right? The hypnosis is not addressing any kind of an underlying physical issue in the brain, so why is it helping people? Watching these demonstrations at this clinic is probably the start of modern therapy, essentially, if you want to talk about it that way. This had a major influence on Freud, and it led him to start to think about the psychological causes of mental illnesses. He was also very interested in how these hypnotized people behaved, because they started doing stuff or saying things or having these kind of mental processes that they didn't seem to be aware of prior to being hypnotized. In other words, there were unconscious thoughts or unconscious behaviors that were wandering around in there. So a little bit earlier, 1880, there's this psychologist, Joseph Breuer, and he begins working with this patient who became known as Anna O. Anna O was the pseudonym for Bertha Pappenheim, who was herself actually a fairly well-known figure at the time. She was an Austrian Jewish feminist and social pioneer, and this is probably the most well-known case study in psychology kind of period. What kicked things off was that Pappenheim was with her ailing father at night, And she was suddenly tormented by these hallucinations and just this sense of overwhelming anxiety. And her symptoms just got worse and worse and worse. They included visual disturbances, headaches, hallucinations, and memory loss, which became a major focus of their work together. The family reached out to Breuer. He had no idea what was going on. He was like, these symptoms are way beyond most of what I see in people. And he tried a bunch of different stuff. He tried feeding her food directly, like by hand when she rejected food, dosages of chloral. This is this light sedative. And then he started trying to hypnotize her, essentially. And he began to encourage her to narrate stories about her past and speak freely about her experiences and her emotions. And he found that over time, very slowly, this led to some relief from her symptoms. And this began this process that Breuer referred to as remembering work in his writing. And as you said earlier in the episode, Dad, Pappenheim called the talking cure. And she was slowly able to recover, as near as we can tell. It's possible she was also inventing them, but who knows, to recover these kind of repressed memories, form a more coherent narrative of what was going on, what led up to that night, what experiences were going on in the field between her and her dad, all of that kind of stuff, and eventually experience them out. And now, Breuer's work with Pappenheim influenced Freud a lot. He ended up writing the classic Studies on Hysteria with Breuer, and then in 1899, published in 1900, Freud writes on the interpretation of dreams, which is kind of kicks off psychoanalysis as a field. So that's everything that was going on. That's how we got to this kind of exploration of, wow, you sit in a room with another person and you talk about stuff, and it doesn't just make you kind of feel better emotionally. It's an actual treatment methodology for symptomology inside of the medical model. And I just thought that that kind of context was so cool. And understanding that, for me at least, was so helpful in terms of like really getting where these ideas came from. Because there are all of these ideas that we have in psychology or therapy that we just take for granted. We just kind of take it for granted at this point that like talking to somebody helps you feel better and relieves your symptoms. But somebody had to actually figure that out. And this was the actual figure that out part. So that's kind of the very early history and some context for what we might kind of talk about in a moment.
That's fantastic, Forrest. And quick question, in your investigations of the details of the case history of Anna O, was there any reference to glove paralysis?
So this is so funny, Dad. I actually did look into this. So, okay, you've told a story on the podcast in the past of glove paralysis, this idea that there was a person, maybe it was Anna O or Pappenheim, and the idea is that this person wanted to essentially strike their father. But it was totally inappropriate to do so. They had a lot of like repressed rage. And so what they did is they really cut off the neurons in their hand in the shape of a glove, is the phrase that you'll sometimes see. And this directly led to a paralysis of their hand. Here's the problem. The story is totally apocryphal. It doesn't actually exist. It's not a real story. So here's what I mean. It's such a good one. It's such a good one, but it's not a real story. And I was so fascinated when I went down the rabbit hole here. So what you do see is in Freud's writing, there is a lot of talking about essentially neurologically impossible paralysis. So the idea that you could like cut off an arm in a really perfect way paralytically when our nerves don't actually work that way in the arm.
Right.
So it's not possible for you to be physically paralyzed, and yet the person appears to be paralyzed regardless. So this was absolutely something that he was talking about. And the glove example is a really convenient example. But as near as we can tell, never happened, didn't exist, all of that. It's the classic apocryphal story. Yeah, really interesting.
Right. Wow. Keep on going with this account. This is fascinating. This is better than television. I love this.
So that's the kind of medical history of all of this. How did we get to Freud kind of thinking about this stuff? So then we need to talk a little bit about what was he thinking about? Why was he thinking about this? And this is where we get into more of the philosophical side of it. So I mentioned Schopenhauer earlier. This was this guy who's kind of thinking about the unconscious. And he wrote this book called The World as Will and Representation. He talked about this sort of mystical force called the capital W will. And you can kind of see aspects of this start to flow into Freud's general notion of the unconscious as this like reservoir of deep thought and a kind of almost like spiritual or metaphysical aspect to the whole thing, which, okay, is starting to influence some of Freud's thoughts. Nietzsche had this notion of the will to power, which was very influential on Jung. He was very vague about what this was exactly, but it was kind of the desire that we have to overcome obstacles and actualize ourselves. And then we get to Hobbes, who's the guy who I really want to focus on here. He was an English philosopher. He was best known for his work in political philosophy, and he argued the famous Hobbes lines is that humans exist in a state of nature that is a war of all against all, where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And our only way out is to surrender our individual freedom, because if we act on those things, we'll be screwed in a variety of ways. We'll behave poorly, we won't get what we want, in a social contract with a, in quotes, absolute sovereign. That was his line. And this is essentially some kind of a single individual or a government that has complete authority. So what does Hobbes have to do with psychoanalysis? Okay, the late 19th century was in many ways defined by colonialism. This was the massive expansion of European empire into Africa, Asia, the Pacific, where all of these imperial powers were vying for control of different kinds of resources and markets, and they were able to project that power through their industrial development. When I talk about psychoanalysis on the show in the past, I'm not trying to just like nod in the direction of like colonialism bad. Understanding that Western psychology was born swimming in this cultural milieu has direct and practical consequences on the kinds of theories that were developed and how we think about the field today. So to oversimplify this a lot, there are two lenses that we can view human behavior through. First, our underlying nature is mostly good, but our experiences lead us to develop problematic forms of coping. That way, we have to clear away the inhibitions that we have to our goodness and let it flow through. Second possibility, our underlying nature is mostly bad. And to civilize ourselves, and I use that word deliberately, we must inhibit our impulses and apply a lot of top-down control. The first one of those is the cornerstone of humanistic psychology. That's the core belief. People pretty good, got to clear away the cobwebs. Second one of those, that's the cornerstone of psychoanalysis, what we're talking about today. People mostly bad, got to be really thoughtful about regulation and find healthy ways to regulate these bad impulses.
Only because I'm a friendly neighbor to psychoanalysis. The origins, absolutely Victorian era, the sensibility of the time, and the clinical practice of Freud with the people he was working with definitely informed a view that the id, that bubbling cauldron underneath it all, is definitely kind of nasty and icky poo-poo. I would say many, many people today who practice even fairly traditional forms of psychoanalysis and not its evolution.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah, they would not subscribe to that view per se. They're simply working with what's there.
As we'll talk about a little bit the next time that we do an episode on this, people took this route and took it up to a totally different tree. There's a lot of distance between these kind of core ideas and the way that people actually practice these days, or even Jung. Jung, in his own way, was much more curious. He talked about the shadow, which we'll probably talk about next time. He was actually quite curious about what's in the shadow. And are there some aspects of the shadow that like maybe they aren't so bad, but we just kind of think that they're bad, huh? And that kind of inquiry itself is a sort of softening of what I'm talking about already. But one thing I do want to emphasize here a little bit is that colonialism broadly was typically justified on this kind of a philosophical basis. You know, we're bringing civilization and modern ways of thinking and being to the uncivilized and barbaric people of the world, right? And there's this kind of direct relationship between that line of thought and this notion of the more savage id versus the civilized ego and superego. And you can even see this in other theory of the time. There's this idea of something called recapitulation theory, which is this really wild thought. It came from this guy, Carl Conrad Geiss, if I'm saying that correctly, which is the view that an embryo and then the child itself repeats the life history of the race in the life history of the individual. So in other words, the embryo and the child progresses through primitive stages of development before getting to the advanced stage of development that is possessed by adult humans in a manner that mirrors the evolution of the species as a whole. And this was then taken by various forms of writing at the time. There was one piece of writing which is really quite something, if you want to read it, called Lo the Poor Indian. You can look that one up on your own. That really applies a lot of these ideas. And there was a lot of thinking broadly in the world at the time and positioning of people outside of Europe as essentially using the language of children, like referring to them as these like young or excessively expressive individuals who needed to essentially be parented by somebody. And so that became the sort of philosophical explanation for so much horror and genocide and everything else that was just going on in the world at the time. And I just think we have to be a little careful in how we inadvertently apply some of these ideas to our own psychology. And you can see this really clean flowing back and forth, I think, between some of these concepts and even the nature of the power relationship between the analyst and the client in the room, right? The analyst is the one who knows. Investigation of defense and resistance is a major part of psychoanalytic theory. How is the client resistant to the truth shared by the analyst? There's this parental model, this authority model, in terms of being the one who knows.
I'm so glad you're talking about this, Forrest. I mean, it's such a service, in addition to a kind of didactic presentation that's interesting in its own right.
I apologize, by the way, if this is too much of a monologue, but I'm just so into it,
But it also is very deeply moral, what you're getting at, and very relevant to the times in which we live. I want to say two things. First, about Hobbes. Hobbes is absolutely wrong scientifically. The incredibly strong evidence, which draws on the academic work of people like Paul Gilbert and others, who then draw on the work of others who have established absolutely clearly that the human species, unlike every other of the several hundred primate species, evolved a form of social organization, a form of politics inside the band of 40 to 50 people who lived together most of their lives that was grounded in what's called caring and sharing, compassion and justice, in other words. That's the model inside the bands. Between bands, humans enacted that more primitive model of fearing and dominating, aggressing on, murdering other bands, competing for scarce resources. But within their bands, life was not solitary. It was profoundly relational, rested in compassion rather than brutish, and it enabled often fairly long lifespans that created the basis for the evolution in humans, unlike almost all other species, of grandmothers, of women in particular, who lived past their sexual capabilities, in other words, past menopause, who could then therefore tend to and befriend the children, in that band. So that's it on you, Hobbes, justifying, a bunch of, asshole kings. That said, you're also really getting at, Forrest, the haunting fact that these seemingly neutral ideas, often advocated with a lot of polish, and you see versions of that today, in the politics in America and around the world, the key question about these ideas is, what function do they serve?
100%.
In the Latin proverb, cui bene, who benefits? And all this fancy lingo basically was used to just simply justify the profound extractive theft of natural resources from Africa, Latin America, Asia, and elsewhere. And in America, the labor for many centuries, it was theft. It was appropriation. It was extraction. And people have estimated that the dollar value of that which has been extracted through colonialism is countless trillions of dollars. So maybe this is not so much our general topic here on the podcast, but I really love what you're bringing up here.
Right. Yeah, no, so that's all like a lot of good context for this specifically. But I do think it's helpful to make a kind of a key point in much the way that you are here, Dad, which is that there's a direct connection between what's going on in the counseling office and the thoughts that people are having outside of it. There's a direct connection between what's going on politically in the world and the thoughts that people have about the nature of people or individuals. And a lot of that political theory flows very directly from beliefs that we have about, is a person good or is a person bad? Yeah. You could go take this very directly to ideas about incarceration or ideas about rehabilitation, like that kind of notion, right? So you can just see the tendrils here. And if you wanted to summarize very, very early psychoanalysis, not so much the way it's practiced today, but very, very early psychoanalysis as like how to colonize the mind, I wouldn't really stop you. And I understand.
What a phrase, Forrest.
You like that one?
How to colonize your own mind
Yeah.
or the minds of your patients.
Sure.
Ooh,
And I don't love
yeah,
that so much. And I think that there is a place, as has been explored, and I
yeah.
want to be really clear about this, in more modern approaches to psychoanalytic theory for asking not just like, how do we colonize this, but instead, how do we allow it to liberate itself to some extent? How do we allow our impulses to be expressed in healthier ways, sublimation, that kind of thing? So this then takes us, with the, little bit of remaining time that we have, to more of a conversation about Freud himself. Freud is a complicated figure in the history of psychology. He, on the one hand, is kind of the grandparent of the whole thing. On the other hand, he was a brilliant individual, a doctor, a thinker. And on the other hand, he did some really shady stuff. But I think that it's important to, again, contextualize all of this. If the experiences of my friends in graduate school are any indicator, it has become very trendy to be very critical of psychoanalysis and particularly very critical of Freud. Sometimes this is because people haven't actually read Freud and they're just kind of rolling with the vibes in the field at the time. Sometimes it's because Freud's body of writing is unbelievably enormous. I attempted to begin to make a dent in it as part of prep for this episode, and I got to tell you, I did not get very far because there is just so much. You're holding up, the Freud reader, Peter Gay. Yeah, Life for Our Time. Absolutely. Okay.
This is a super cool book. It's very readable. A detail. Freud never got a Nobel Prize in medicine. On the other hand, he received a Goethe Prize for writing, and he was just an amazing writer. Yeah. So but you're right. His work is voluminous. Yep.
Yeah. There's just so much.
And it's quite well summarized in a biographical frame in this, beautifully written book, which is very thick because
very, very thick.
And
also,
to talk about.
He was on the cutting edge.
Yeah.
Like, he was making this stuff up. They were all vibing with it. And because they were just sort of figuring it out, guess what? His views on stuff changed a lot over time. Right. If you look at Freud's writing in 1900 versus writing in the 1920s, it's very, very different. Like, he really changed how he thought about things. And so it's difficult to say, what did Freud think about fill in the blank? Because guess what? It changed. It's also worth mentioning, as you mentioned, Dad, that Freud himself was a member of a marginalized and persecuted group. He was Jewish. He was living in Austria in the early 1900s. And worth flagging, a major reason that he tabbed Jung as his successor was because Jung wasn't Jewish. And Freud believed that having a non-Jewish figurehead could lead to broader acceptance of these ideas. In 1933, toward the end of Freud's life, the Nazi Party took control of Germany, and they went out of their way to burn his books. And he had this great line, I forget where I saw it, and I'm going to just paraphrase it here, but this great line where he said, "Wow, such progress. They're burning my books. They 100 years ago, they would have just burned me." Just 13 days, 2 weeks, after Hitler's troops marched into Austria, the Gestapo showed up at Freud's house in Vienna, and they abducted his daughter, Anna Freud. She was released after hours of questioning. This eventually led to her and Freud fleeing to London. And 4 of Freud's sisters who were unable to leave the country either died in the ghettos or the gas chambers. None of them got out of it alive.
Wow. I didn't know that detail.
Yeah.
Oh, dear.
It's haunting. It's like, oh my God.
Oh, man.
Even after all of this, Freud was, as you mentioned, Dad, well-to-do. He was comfortable, and he was a member of upper-class society. Power and people and privilege are all very complicated things. It's a bit difficult for me personally to square that individual history as being a member of a group in Europe at that time that was receiving such intense persecution with the kind of typical story that is often told about Freud. And, I just think that this stuff is very complicated.
Yeah.
Yes, there's the major influence of colonial thought. On the other hand, he's the member of this persecuted group. Like, identity is a complex thing. That being said, some of the criticisms of Freud are absolutely legit. There was a lot of cultural bias. There were particularly a lot of patriarchal norms in his work. The idea that, for example, feminine or female psychology was like purely derivative of male psychology in some kind of sense. And there have been a lot of feminist critiques and reframings of Freud's work. Most prominently, probably from UC Berkeley professor Nancy Chodorow. She had 2 books, Feminism and Psychoanalytic Theory, and then The Reproduction of Mothering, 2 kind of classics from that perspective in the field. there was also a lack of science in his science often, as you're talking about the kind of uncomfortable relationship with Western medicine at the beginning there, Dad. There was his extreme focus on sexuality, which we've already talked about. And then he had really not great professional ethics. I'm not sure if he ever actually slept with any of his clients the way that Jung did, but there was this particular case I ran into where he essentially advised a man's wealthy wife, and the wealthy wife was a client of his, to leave him and marry her former analyst, who was also a former patient of Freud's. And this ultimately led to disaster befalling everybody. It was a total nightmare. And it's possible that he actually did this because he was hoping that this wealthy individual would take all of that money and donate it to like an endowment for Freud in the United States or something like that, like an endowment for psychoanalysis in the United States. Some of this, by the way, comes from the book Psych. That's by Paul Bloom. It was one of the ones that I read to prep for this episode. Another one, Freud, Inventor of the Modern Mind, by Peter Kramer. That's where I'm getting this stuff from. And I just think it's complicated. And I don't know how to ground all of this in an understanding that is useful for people that we do on this podcast of like therapy and mental health with this complex individual who was clearly so influential in the development of this field as a whole that we talk about all the time. And I'm kind of wondering how you think about it, Dad.
I find myself, as your dad, wondering what's it like for you to come up against or enter into this really rich and deep material about the human psyche, which is really grounded deeply. They bring a kind of high-level analytic approach to an exploration of what is extraordinary, which is considered to be, and which in many ways is, very nonverbal, juicy, primal, and very rooted developmentally into our evolution from animals, other animals that are, much more primitive than we are, if you will, in terms of their intellectual capacities, at least. So what's that like for you? And in a way, Freud himself was an explorer. He popped open the door to this vast territory, this vast park. He invited, really, certainly in the West, the rest of culture to enter into it. I mean, people have said, in a way, we're living in the world of two major people, Darwin and Freud, and with all the implications of that. And so he himself, of course, was on that journey. He was subject to intense criticism. He dealt with mortal threats. Late in life, he had, mouth cancer. He had to really deal with that as well. And so the real takeaway in a lot of ways is what's it like for each of us to explore, if you will, the Freudian aspects of our own psyche. You can decide which those are, but to explore that. And I think that's kind of what's central here. I think civilization, I think individuals and the culture are still uneasy often about the territory that Freud opened the gates to and explored himself and developed a variety of tools for understanding. We're still kind of uncomfortable with all that. And I think individuals themselves, when they encounter this material, can be really drawn to it, but also really uncomfortable about it as well.
For starters, I found this totally interesting and very personally useful, in part for doing my job. It's so helpful to see how all of these little dots connect to each other and how we can trace this kind of direct line from the way that people practice therapy, sure, but also just the way we talk about mental health, the way we talk about these kind of forces inside of the mind, inner conflict. A huge part of the work that I do as an individual in the space is about inner conflict, essentially. It's about feeling stuck in some kind of a way, feeling like there's a knot, a kind of Gordian knot for you that you want to slice, and you just can't figure out how to cut it. But what we find is much like, Alexander with the knot, what he did is he found a unique solution to it. He was able to take a step back, release his assumptions about how to untie a knot, and have this kind of critical moment where, depending on who you ask, he either sliced through it with his sword or he kind of pulled out this peg that was holding the knot together, and it all just unraveled in front of him. I think there's a close relationship between that and psychoanalysis. This deep investigation of the mind, often a kind of very emotionally driven one, and one that isn't so cognitive all of the time. In fact, sometimes the thoughts kind of get in the way in a funny sort of way. And it's also really helped me see something that you've pulled out on the podcast a lot in the past, Dad, which is the pendulum swing inside of psychology, back and forth. I think the field has grappled with how scientific does it want to be since it was created. I think it's grappled with how medical does it want to be since it was created. There are a lot of people who have searing critiques of the DSM as an object that exists in the field at all.
Yeah.
And I think it was just kind of personally helpful for me to understand where all of this was coming from and really get it in more of a real kind of way. And to see this conflict played out both in macro over the history of the field and in miniature inside of psychoanalysis, inside of humanism, inside of whatever it is from there, and so that was just very personally useful for me and gave me some good perspective on all of this, I think.
Reflecting here as we finish, I think one of the experiences that can come through a psychoanalysis or even a close and friendly familiarity with its central ideas is the potentially disorienting and unnerving recognition that you are not the master of your own house, that your psyche, the totality of who you are, is much more complex than the so-called observing ego, the central executive processes in the neural mental streaming of consciousness. There's so much else that's going on. And that can be both unnerving and humbling in a really good way. And it can also create more tolerance and spaciousness for other people who act in various ways. And you start to realize, oh, okay, it is complexity unfolding. Like you, like me. Over there is happening what's happening over here. Complexity unfolding. That's very deep. And it's interesting when I think about that applied to colonialism. These European powers and versions of this during, slavery in America wanted to presume that they were the masters of their own house. And yet deep down, I think there was this uneasy realization that they depended immensely on either the stolen labor or the stolen resources of other people. And precisely because they were so dependent on that, and there was also such an innate moral issue arising from that, that they did what Freud would call reaction formation, in which they hyper-developed an ideology and a sense of moral superiority that was intense in proportion to the dependence they had on those resources, physical or labor, and also their own sense of moral self-doubt. Isn't it interesting? And so to the extent to which people are alarmed by their own depths and the vastness of it all, then they tend to create tight ego structures that are overly defended and beleaguered and isolated and alienated from the totality of themselves. Yet on the other hand, the recognition that you are not the master of your own house can lead you into a deep appreciation for your house as a whole and all the inhabitants within it.
I think that notion of inclusion is a good one, and which is kind of fundamental to psychoanalysis, as we'll talk about the next time that we do a psychoanalysis episode. This idea of bringing these aspects together as opposed to pushing them down in different kinds of ways. And I do think that that's one of the things we can really learn from it. I want to do a couple more things that I think people can take from psychoanalysis, but I'm going to leave that for the outro of the conversation, Dad. I really appreciate doing all of this with you today, and you kind of bearing with me as I worked through this in a much more didactic way than we typically do on the podcast. But I just got so into it as I was learning about it. And it was such a cool experience to dig into the history of it in this kind of way.
Ah, beautiful. This is one of the most interesting episodes, certainly for me.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad you feel that way. I had a really interesting time talking with Rick today about psychoanalysis. It's one of the longest and deepest episodes that we've done. I learned an enormous amount preparing for this episode, and I tried to share that with all of you today. I hope that you found this interesting. I'd be very curious to hear some feedback from people about whether or not this was the kind of episode that they're interested in. Of course, if you made it to the end here in the recap, it's probably more likely that you were interested in the material than a random person, but hey, It's all still useful to us anyway. And there were a variety of themes that ran throughout the episode. The first one is a question of context. How can we understand the context of psychoanalysis in particular and different approaches to therapy in general? Schools of thought do not emerge out of thin air. They're relational. They're based on other stuff that's going on in the world, historical events, philosophy, the way that people think about other people. And different sets of assumptions that we have about the nature of people or the nature of the mind can lead to very different approaches to therapy and clinical practice, which is, and this is another thing that we talked about a good bit, grounded in that Western medical model. If we were just talking about two people having a nice time talking about ideas, and maybe one of them feels a little bit better at the end of it, it would kind of be one thing. But the real decisive move of psychoanalysis was to position this work as medical treatment. The point of this was to alleviate mental illness. And once you're in that world, the stakes are a little bit higher. And theoretically, we're wandering into the world of medicine and science. And when you're wandering into the world of medicine and science, you don't necessarily want your interventions to be dictated by, for example, the philosophy of the time. That is not very medical in nature. You want to do what you can to ground yourself in the facts of reality. But how do we figure out the facts of reality when we are dealing with one person's unique unconscious mind? This stuff gets very complicated very quickly. And it's part of the reason that psychology and the medical establishment, through psychiatry and branches like that, have had a kind of complicated relationship over the last 100 years. It's also one of the reasons that it's fairly common for people who are from more of a hard science background to sort of turn up their nose a little bit at psychology as a science and kind of roll their eyes at the idea of it as a science in general, because it's a little bit softer in nature. And these questions certainly persist inside of it. Then there were two other questions that ran throughout the episode. The first was, how do we separate the art from the artist? How do we separate psychoanalysis as an approach to therapy, particularly one that, at least to some extent, is still practiced these days, from its context? And how do we take the good ideas in psychoanalysis and kind of separate them out from some of that particularly more problematic context? Then how do we look at Freud as an individual and separate psychoanalysis out from Freud? How was Freud problematic? How was he a brilliant mind of the time? How did he have this incredible insight? How is he doing really questionable stuff with his clients? These are really complicated questions, and they're not so obvious. And a lot of the time what happens when people talk about psychoanalysis or Freud or whatever it is they're very reductive one way or the other. And this episode was kind of an attempt to provide more of a nuanced yes and view on all of these questions. So I'm going to try to run through what we talked about during the episode. It's going to be tricky to summarize. I'll do my best to do this fairly briefly. So we started with, what is psychoanalysis? It's the origin point for modern talk therapy, and it's a set of theory and technique that focuses on the unconscious mind. One of the real insights from psychoanalysis was not just that sort of psychogenic content. This is the stuff that's bouncing around inside of your head, your emotions, your feelings, your mental activity of different kinds. Not only could this lead to mental illness, but you could be totally unaware of it while it was creating mental illness. Prior to psychoanalysis, the Western medical model framed mental illness as being largely physical in nature, based on issues with the brain itself more often than not. So the key insights that psychoanalysis had were, for starters, the first two I named, that psychological causes are the source of many mental illnesses. And then second, those causes are unconscious. From there, the third one was that those unconscious processes are dynamic in nature. The fourth was that mental and physical symptoms are interconnected. And the fifth is that processing this psychic material can lead to some relief from symptoms. Freud did not discover the unconscious, but it was a big part of his work, as were a variety of other ideas that we explored early on in the episode. First, this idea of a layered mind, and this comes in large part from Freud's 1923 work, The Ego and the Id. The mind exists in three layers, according to Freud. This was the conscious mind, information that is currently in our awareness. Then second, the preconscious mind, information that is not currently in our awareness, but which we can access fairly easily. And then third, the unconscious mind. This is information that is outside of our immediate awareness, but theoretically we could get to. We just don't really know how. These layers of the mind also relate to the mind's three main protagonists. This is the superego, the ego, and the id. The superego is our more moral conscious. The id is our unconscious and instinctual drives. And then the ego is our kind of practical and more realistic part that tries to mediate between these two superpowers inside of the mind. The id is probably the most interesting character among them inside of Freud's work. It is an entirely unconscious force that operates based on what he called the pleasure principle. It wants to immediately satisfy its wants, its needs, and its baser desires, largely regardless of the cost. And this relates to something we talked about quite a bit during the episode, which was Freud's relatively unkind view of human nature, which was dictated by some of the philosophy of the time, particularly Thomas Hobbes. So Freud thought that the id was the primary component of personality, and it was present from birth. We popped out with it, and it was the source of all of our mental energy, all of our psychic energy is what he called it. And this would make it, therefore, the kind of primary component of personality. It is the bedrock of the mind. And then the job of the superego, and to some extent the ego, is to fight a generally losing battle against the id, harnessing its power, hopefully in the pursuit of more positive goals. And that's how we get to repression. So Freud believed that we never really forgot anything and that all of our experiences were held inside of the mind or body in some fashion. This unconscious material that we had was indestructible in nature. What this means is that, sure, we could push it down, but pushing it down doesn't get rid of it, and eventually it bubbles out of us in the form of things like Freudian slips or various projections that we might have, or strange behavior, or, hey, mental illness in different kinds of ways. Other key ideas from Freud that we talked about quite a bit during the episode were experiencing out, transference, and countertransference, and the notion of psychological defenses. We'll probably go into all of these in more detail the next time that we do a psychoanalysis episode. A big part of Freud's work was also sexuality and the development of sexuality, and Rick and I talked a bit about this. One of the points that Rick made that I thought was a good point is that for all of the problems with this line of inquiry that Freud had, he was highlighting something that is actually pretty useful for us, which is an understanding that kids are not little adults. We then talked a little bit about what psychoanalysis is actually like, some of the key features of it, how it goes on for a very long period of time in terms of the more traditional forms of psychoanalysis, and some of the processes that people do inside of it, like free association. You see that a lot in the Anna O case study, dream analysis, exploring transference, and what's called resistance analysis that we didn't talk about very much. But it's actually an interesting one because it gets to some of the colonial mentality that I was talking about later in the episode. The basic idea is that clients have behaviors that block progress. Maybe they are missing sessions or changing topics when the analyst doesn't want them to, or otherwise being defensive. Now, there are absolutely forms of resistance that pop up in therapy. They can be a good guide for the therapist. But the notion of resistance broadly is actually really a very complicated one, and it can be quite difficult to tell, is this person being resistant, or am I being a little clumsy as a clinician? And Freud, in his very Freud way, as near as I can tell based on the reading that I've done, and I'm not a professor of psychology, take it with a grain of salt, he seemed to more often than not put most of the blame on his clients, including coming up with a wide variety of truly out there diagnoses for pretty normal basic behaviors. Two stuck out to me from Paul Bloom's book, Psych. This is a direct quote from the book. The effects on a boy if their mother dies and the father raises him: homosexuality due to exaggerated castration anxiety. A young girl in a therapy session who pulls her skirt over her exposed ankle: tendencies toward exhibitionism. As time has gone on, psychoanalysis has changed a lot. That's what we're going to talk about a bit in our next episode on this topic. And what's emerged are what are called more brief psychodynamic therapies, as well as an integration of psychoanalytic approaches into other forms of therapies. Typically, these brief therapies are less than 25 sessions. The clinician is much more active, and they tend to focus on a specific issue or conflict. I then did an early history of psychoanalysis that I will not go all the way through again. The quick summary of it is that Freud was a neurologist who was really interested in the brain. He saw a series of demonstrations focused on treating hysteria. And then there was this other guy, Joseph Breuer, who was working with a client and tried to treat her hysteria. By the way, hysteria as a diagnosis in general, we used it a lot during the episode, has been totally discredited. It's not a real diagnosis. It's sort of an early precursor to BPD, but it was heavily loaded with a lot of sexist beliefs and content and nonsense. One of the best lines I've ever run into about hysteria is that it was a diagnosis for everything that men did not understand about women. I thought that line probably summarized it better than I possibly could. But anyway, Breuer tried to treat Bertha Pappenheim's hysteria and eventually kind of stumbled on this talking cure that Freud took a lot of interest in. They eventually wrote a book together, and Freud kind of took the idea and ran with it. From there, we talked a lot about historical and social context. We talked about the philosophy that influenced early psychoanalysis. This was predominantly Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Thomas Hobbes. Based on my personal reading of it, I'm sure that there were many other philosophical influences. I'm not a professor of psychology. I'm sure I left a lot out during this episode, and even doing it in 90 minutes, I feel like we could have done hours and hours more on this particular topic. But those were some of the ideas that were very influential. And I think it's very difficult, as we talked about, to separate psychoanalysis from the moment in European history that it existed in, and particularly its connections with more colonial thought. These same assumptions that Freud was working from. Human nature is mostly kind of uncivilized and negative, and what we really need to do is we need to essentially civilize the mind. Well, those were the same assumptions about people that were driving this pretty dark period in human history. The point here is that there is a direct connection between what's going on in the counseling office and the philosophy and history and context that's happening outside of it. To really zoom this out here, this matters not just for psychoanalysis. This matters for everything. Every school of medicine, every school of therapy, every choice that we make about the kinds of content that we want to engage with online and the people who are creating that content. They are all contextual in nature. They all have their own view about the way that people are, how we should interact with each other, the kinds of values that we hold. And we are just kidding ourselves if we act like that doesn't show up in the counseling office. Freud was a complicated guy. We didn't really talk about this during the episode, but you could view psychoanalysis as one big case of projection. Freud had a very strange relationship with his mom, Amalia Freud. She was the second wife of Freud's father, Jacob, and Sigmund was her first child. And she was almost as close in age to him as she was to her husband. And there's a lot of evidence that they had an enmeshed relationship with each other. Also, Freud developed most of psychoanalysis through intense self-analysis, especially after his father's death. And what does Freud focus on in his work? Repression, unconscious desires, guilt, inner conflict. All of the things that he himself as a person was clearly to some extent tormented by. And when you think about his focus on like the Oedipus complex or things like that in relationship to his relationship with his mom, it's easy to interpret this as less being about people in general and more about Freud as a person. And I just want to say for a second that this is at least somewhat normal, not so much Freud's behavior, I don't want to normalize that, but just the idea of research is me-search. It is everywhere in the social sciences, right? People investigate the things that they themselves are struggling with. Okay, so all that said, after this very long recap, what are we left with here? There's a lot in psychoanalysis that does not hold up under modern scrutiny. It just doesn't. But there's still a lot that I think that people can really take from this. First of all, psychoanalysis fundamentally changed how people thought about mental illness in Western medicine. You cannot overstate the importance of this shift. And it was a shift from mental illness as a brain disease to the idea that we are complex beings full of competing forces that we do not entirely understand. Freud in particular, and the psychoanalysts in general, also put an enormous amount of weight on narrative and meaning and personal history as the way into understanding what's going on in somebody's mind. And then, of course, there was the invention of the talking cure at all, the idea that talking to somebody who knew what they were doing about these kinds of problems could help you get a lot better. We just don't have therapy as we currently understand it without that first step. Then there were some concepts that aged really well. The idea that we're not going to be aware of everything that's going on inside of us. The notion of the mind as being made up of parts. If you look at IFS, other modern approaches to therapy, this is all over the place. And it also connects to the overall dynamic model of the mind. Psychodynamics is a huge field, a huge set of approaches to therapy. Transference and countertransference comes from psychoanalysis. People in other forms of therapy use those all the time. And then just the existence of defense mechanisms at all, and particularly their application in more cognitive and behavioral approaches to therapy. We also have psychoanalysis and Anna Freud in particular to really thank for that. if you take one thing from this episode, I hope it's this. This stuff is complicated. It is not so simple. And I would encourage you to be at least a little bit skeptical if you feel like somebody is trying to parrot a very simplistic version of all of this. Freud bad is not very useful commentary. I'm not sure that Freud good is very useful commentary either. It's always more complicated than that. And not to opine for a second, but I just think it's unfortunate that we've gotten to a place in the culture where that kind of a nuanced take just doesn't rise to the top of the pot that often. So, as always on the podcast, what we're left with is a bit of the middle path. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I learned an enormous amount doing this. If you'd like to support the show, you can find us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. Just costs a couple of dollars a month, and you can get transcripts and ad-free versions of the show. You can also find us on YouTube. If you're watching there, if you could subscribe now, that would really help us out. We're also on Spotify, Apple, all of the various podcast platforms. If you could leave a comment there on any of those, that also really helps. Hey, also helps on YouTube for the old algorithm. We really appreciate that. And until next time, thanks again for listening to the end of this very long episode, and we'll talk to you soon.